Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I'm Halise Lieberman, the director of the Toby Center for Jewish Life and Learning, and I'm privileged to welcome you to this session of TJHT Talks in commemoration of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We are very pleased and honored that you have decided to join us this evening, and our special guests, scholars, Dr. Natalia Alexian, the Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Florida, Professor Javi Dreyfus from Tel Aviv University and Yad Vashem, Professor Avinoam Pat of the Holocaust Studies at NYU, New York University, and Professor Piotr Floritsky from the Adam Mickiewicz Institute and University here in Poland. As always, for those of you who are new, we welcome you, especially for those of you who've been with us before. Our program will last approximately 45 minutes, and it will be followed by a Q&A session with our preeminent scholars. We invite you to put comments or questions, particularly questions, in the chat section, and please do let us know where you're calling from. Professor Alexian, Natalia, if I may, I am turning the mic over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Halise. And I am very grateful and honored to be here in this conversation with my wonderful colleagues, friends, and scholars, and a conversation that we very much hope to involve you as well. We wanted to talk together about some of the new challenges in teaching the Holocaust in different contexts, different ways, to different audiences, but in a particular new context of the situation in Israel, the situation in Ukraine. But I want to start with asking my wonderful colleagues about their approach to Holocaust education in general. So to get us started, not in direct response to the events of the last 2 years, to share with us how they see the different contexts in which they teach the Holocaust, the different frameworks, the goals. And when I mention frameworks, I'm thinking in particular about how Holocaust history can be taught in Poland, in Israel, and in the United States as part of Jewish history, as part of Polish history, European history, history of anti-Semitism, or comparative genocides. And we are thrilled to have here people who teach in those very different contexts, very different political and national contexts. So if you can get us started with your experience so far, and I will ask Javi to start. I will skip the professors because we all know one another well. So Javi, if you can share with us your experience.
Thank you, dear Natalia, and thank you, Halise. And thank you for this broad discussion on Holocaust education. And as you said, I think that what makes this discussion extremely interesting is that we come from different traditions of Holocaust education, and we teach different audience, whether in the United States, Europe, Poland, or in Israel. So our challenges might differ, yet I think that we have some common challenges as well, studying Holocaust, anti-Semitism, genocide in each one of those communities. Regarding Israel, I'm teaching in Tel Aviv University this year. For personal reasons, I haven't started the semester, yet I'm teaching usually as part of the Department of Jewish History, and the vast majority of my students are Israelis and they are Jewish, and most of them are historians, though we have students that are coming from other disciplines as well. Teaching them, my goals are to try to enable them to achieve more knowledge and provide them with tools that can help those students to pose complicated questions about individuals and about communities during extreme times during the Holocaust. So I'm mainly teaching within the prism of the Jewish history and the history of the Jewish people. But I'm trying to emphasize also other contexts, as you just mentioned. And although the term context has some bad reputation nowadays, I think it is important, because I think that each one of those different contexts enable me to discuss with my students different aspects. For example, when we talk about Jewish history, so it raises questions regarding the collapse of communities, leadership, and more. When we talk about European history or Polish history, it raises question about Polish and Jewish relationship, as well as the questions regarding the Holocaust as a European project, which we discuss quite a lot today. And anti-Semitism raises questions not only about what was the place of anti-Semitism within Holocaust, but also we know that there was a great variety of motives of people to harm Jews. And anti-Semitism is not an answer for everything, even when we talk about Holocaust studies. Genocide, I think, raises question about periodization, about patterns of murder, and of course about comparisons, and I could go on. So each context contributes, I think, distinct perspective and raises unique questions. And of course, beyond those, we also have limitations when we talk about those things, and I'll just mention three of them. One of them is over simplification. We're teaching the Holocaust within a specific historical or national context, and it may risk oversimplification that focus only on one aspect, and this is one thing that we should take into consideration. Another problem is, and again, most of my students are Israeli and Jewish, and that is they might neglect non-Jewish victims or local dynamics, and this is why those aspects are very important. And of course, the challenge of comparison, because many times students think that comparing means that things are equal, and of course, comparing is an important tool. So, last and not the least, if I'll try to answer your question about my approach, it's based first and foremost on documents and on primary source analyses, which I'm trying to enable my students to read different documents. It could be written, it could be photographed, it could be artifacts, and to allow them to try to understand better those times. I'm very much focused on the Jewish perspective, trying to see what we can learn from personal stories, raising ethical dilemmas and moral choices to show how complicated those times were. And one thing that I'm trying to do, especially since the COVID times, is to have many friends and guests who can speak with those students. So my students will be able to hear not only Israeli professors, but some scholars from other places as well. So that was a long answer, and I hope it's okay.
It's a wonderful answer, and it gets us started in a whole range of directions. But before we open all these doors, Avi, if you could share with us your experience, which I believe is primarily from American universities.
Yes. So first of all, thank you, Natalia, and thank you, Halise, for convening and inviting us to be part of this. And it's really exciting for me to be able to participate in this global discussion, as Javi alluded to. There are exciting opportunities and possibilities that have developed, especially since the pandemic, for all of us to join together with Javi, with Piotr, with Natalia, in these types of conversations, which is actually bringing lots of different approaches, comparative approaches, interdisciplinary approaches into conversation. And we should appreciate the novelty of this. So it's exciting to be able to do this now together for a global audience, really. In terms of, in brief, my approaches and where I've taught and the general approach to Holocaust education, which you asked us about, I've been in a number of different settings, first working at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum on the Jewish Responses to Persecution project in particular, and then teaching at a smaller private university, the University of Hartford, and then a large state university, the University of Connecticut, to much larger classes, and now at New York University. And each of those contexts are a little bit different, but in general, my approach to teaching the topic has generally continued this focus of looking primarily at Jewish responses to persecution, teaching the Holocaust within the broader context of Jewish history, which we can discuss, but I think is an important addition to the field, which for many decades, which was a field that was dominated by looking at perpetrator motivation and coming more so from a perspective of German history and trying to integrate the victim perspective, Jewish sources, as Javi alluded to, looking at the voluminous Jewish source material that exists, but for various reasons has not necessarily been used in teaching, and in particular in an American audience because of languages, trying to make these sources available for teaching so that we can have better understanding and appreciation for Jewish responses, and trying to understand how we situate the history of the Holocaust or the Shoah within the broader scope of Jewish history. And in that regard, a lot of my focus also is on trying to understand Jewish responses, both in the continuity of pre-war Jewish life, so making the argument that we cannot understand how Jews responded or Jewish behavior during the war without having a good understanding and grounding in the Jewish history as it existed in the pre-war period. We can't understand Jewish responses if we don't know the people that we're studying. And likewise, a lot of my work has looked at Jewish life in the aftermath. So to some extent, sort of broadening the chronology of the Holocaust and looking at the continuities and discontinuities from life before, during, and after the war. And I'll just say two other things in brief, Natalia. One is to this question about Holocaust education more generally. So one area that I've been involved in, and I think maybe we'll have a chance to discuss this, is there's been a movement in the United States in particular to mandate Holocaust education in many different states. And one of the issues with this is that while there's been political momentum, maybe 5-6 years ago in particular, to mandate and require Holocaust and genocide education, there's great variety in terms of the resources that are provided to teachers as to how to do this. So they're required to do it without necessarily being provided the resources. And so in the positions that I've been in particular at the University of Hartford, University of Connecticut, we did a lot of work in organizing and convening workshops for teachers to provide resources for how to teach the topic, especially with sort of the overwhelming nature of there's so many sources and who knows what to use and how do you do this in a brief time. So really trying to use the expertise of scholars who are coming from the field of Holocaust history and trying to say, best practices for how to do this. And then the last thing that I'll say, because you asked also about anti-Semitism, and I'm sure we'll discuss this further, there's a lot of push to increase education and research on anti-Semitism at NYU. We just announced the creation of a new Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And one of my sort of broader philosophical concerns about both coming from the field of Holocaust history and approaching anti-Semitism within the scope of Jewish history is I have this general concern, which we also approached in designing this large class at the University of Connecticut. For most students who are going to take one class at the university on Jewish history, I have qualms about it only being a class that is framed through the lens of anti-Semitism. And so even in that class, we tried to design it in such a way that even before we introduced concepts like anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, we gave them some brief understanding of who are the Jews, what is Jewish history, what is Jewish culture. Let us define the terms of what it means to be Jewish before we then look at it through the lens of how anti-Semites or haters of Jews throughout history have defined it. So I'll stop myself there, and I look forward to discussing further.
I think that just those two raise several additional questions, and there are interesting overlaps between the two of your statements. But before we do go further, Piotr, would you share with your experience from Poland?
Yes, of course. Thank you, and thank you for having me here among you, and it's an extremely important discussion. Let me say briefly, and let me start from the kind of the statement that probably my position is slightly or even quite different, because I work at the Faculty of Political Science and Journalism, and I do not have any course or just lectures related to the Holocaust, which are somehow obligatory, mandatory for students. but almost each year I try to offer some, let me say, elective optional course about some important issues, about some matters related to the Holocaust, which are, for example, widely discussed in Poland or are somehow problematic. Let me give you an example that, for example, I offered a course about the pogroms in Poland, not only in the context of Jedwabne, but in general, the history of pogroms and also the meaning of the term. What does it mean, a pogrom? And what is the sociology even of pogroms? So, or about the representations of the Holocaust in Polish feature films and many others. And I think that the one important was also about the Polish politics of history towards Holocaust, because it's very important issue, or it was, or it still is, of course, after the election and the political change in Poland. Maybe the direction now are not so clear. And what I noticed and what was the, let me say, very challenging, and what was my goal so far. So first of all, of course, it was the question how to talk about such sensitive topics like Polish complicity in the Holocaust with students which are not so well prepared to this discussion, because their level of knowledge, I realize, is very poor, and it's not the only accusation of the previous levels of education. I will tell something about it more maybe later. And so this is a big challenge for me. The second is how to, for example, overcome the paradigm of Polish innocence and Polish victimhood and so on. This is challenging. The second thing is, it was also my goal, how to incorporate and how to show to students that the Holocaust and all of the relevant events to Holocaust are the part of Polish history, because we still, for example, talking about Polish citizens and how to overcome this dominant, let me say, ethno-nationalistic historiography or the story about the Holocaust. And because in this story, and for many of my students, the story of the Holocaust, it's like there's somebody else's problem. It's not the part of the Polish history. It's not the part of our history. It's something about others, about Jews and, for example, also Germans, because for them mostly a Holocaust is like a Jewish German issue, not not the European case. So this is very, very problematic for me. Still, it's problematic because the Polish history, this is the history of the majority. It's not the history about the minorities. It's not about the history about, in this context, about the Holocaust as a part of the national history. And also, which is still very challenging, and I perceive it as a kind of a goal, is how to overcome all of these Holocaust distortions made so far during the recent years in Poland, because students do not live in any vacuum. They are also consumers of media messages. They, read newspapers. They are after the education at high schools and primary schools. They, of course, they derive some knowledge from school textbooks. And I think that this is not only a challenge for Holocaust scholars; it's also a challenge for Polish politicians. How to let me say, change the situation of the Holocaust scholars in Poland and the level of the education and the content of the education about the Holocaust, because in a previous year, this is kind of a mess. So this is also big problem. And additionally, because of the fact, as we can see based on the recent surveys, that students or just young people, they get the knowledge about the history, about the past, not from the textbooks, not from school, or not mainly, but mostly from the popular culture, mostly from the mass media. So what is challenging also for me is to somehow to provide for them some tools to deal with some fake news, some Holocaust distortion, to deliver them some tools how to deal with the discourse analysis. I find it extremely important to show them, wow, you can easily see, for example, that the dominant story of Polish righteous, which is delivered for you from many different channels, is absolutely incorrect. So we have to start the discussion from the very beginning. That's why I think that also the discussion about the state of public discourse and the condition of media and fake news and so on is very relevant.
This is fantastic. And actually, just to reveal to our audience, I was hoping at the end of the exchange to ask our panelists about their understanding of Holocaust education as act of activism, and Piotr kind of really laid this all out for us already. But I want to go back for a moment to something that we didn't discuss, but to sort of bring it together. So I was thinking how Javi, you mentioned anti-Semitism as something that your students might be bringing to the classroom as a given tool to understand what happened, to understand the destruction of Jewish communities, while Avi took a step back with some hesitation, looking at anti-Semitism as potentially not just a tool that might open all doors. And I'm wondering whether the fact that, Javi, you're teaching primarily Israeli Jewish students, whether you intellectually need to pull them more in the direction of understanding the perpetrators, the bystanders, just to still use the triangle of Raoul Hilberg of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. Do they come with kind of a given interest in the victims, but less so in the other two elements of this triangle? And for Piotr, potentially it's that assumed bystander witnessing position of the students. And Avi, I'm guessing that for your students, it might be really all three elements that need to be elaborated or sort of equally maybe placed into the your educational toolkits. How do you see it? And then we'll move to the more immediate contemporary questions and challenges.
Okay, so I think that one of the general challenges that I'm facing with my students, that all of them, I think I hardly use the word all of them, but in this case I will use it. All of them come with knowledge about the Holocaust, not always accurate knowledge, but they are very sure that that is the real story. It could be I heard from my grandfather, or I saw this movie, or I was in Poland and I had this or that experience. And this is something that many times we have to try to show that things were much more complicated. So, and I'll say even more, I was listening to what Piotr was saying, and if Piotr has to explain that the Holocaust is part of the history, I think that one of the challenges I didn't mention before is to explain to Israeli students that history, Jewish history, is not only the Holocaust. and that you cannot understand Jewish history. And here I'm connecting to what Avi said, with not referring, you must understand the Holocaust in a context of what happened before and after. And it's not a department of Holocaust studies. And actually, I can say that when there were attempts to have some specific program about Holocaust studies, I'm always very hesitant, because I think one should understand it in a much longer perspective. And for me, it's Jewish perspective, but it can be many others. So I guess that one of the things that I'm trying to do is mainly raise question marks. It's true regarding anti-Semitism, but not only. And as Avi said, and as I mentioned before, the anti-Semitism is not an answer to what happened in the Holocaust, and we can elaborate about it much more later on. And we know that there were many motives of people, not only because of that. I personally don't like the traditional triangle of perpetrators and so on, because we know that things are much more complicated today. I think that the Israeli scholarship for years, from when it was established, is more focused on the Jewish experience than on the Germans or other perpetrators. But we have other examples as well, and this what makes this small swamp of Israeli scholarship so interesting. So it's mainly, but not only, Jewish perspective, and within the students as well.
Avi, do you want to jump in?
Sorry. Yes. So this is it's a really fascinating question, and about and I think it's useful, even as we know the field has moved on, but to have this sort of perpetrator, bystander, victim dichotomy, even though we talk about sort of the messy spaces in between, because it's helpful, especially in the framework of this discussion, to think about our different audiences and our different students and the expectations that they bring to bear. And one of the on the topic of learning about the history of the Holocaust, and one of the things that I find especially interesting, and I've looked at a lot in some of my own research, is the distinctions between, first of all, how the teaching of the Holocaust in Israel differs from teaching of the Holocaust in the United States, and how we know that this history sometimes is framed and understood through pre-existing worldviews or political frameworks, and that this history, even at the time, is often understood within those frameworks. And I think, now just to talk for a second about the American context, one of the things that I think has been especially fascinating over recent years, and I have to applaud the efforts of our colleagues at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, who created this exhibit on Americans and the Holocaust, and then the subsequent documentary on the US and the Holocaust, is to really complicate for a general audience in the United States, and probably by and large a non-Jewish audience, but I think also significantly for a Jewish audience, the narrative that they've traditionally received the education about the Holocaust as something horrible that happened over there. Thank God we live here in the United States. Thank God the United States led the war to defeat Nazism, all of which is true, but holding it as an exceptional case of horrible anti-Semitism that could never happen here. And that the exhibit, I think, and then the documentary, the ways in which it's complicated the understanding, is to look at the potentials, the possibilities, to bring to light the history of anti-Semitism in the United States, what Nazi racial ideology learned from the American context, right? To really complicate sort of what were very simplistic narratives of American exceptionalism. And I think, we haven't talked about this much yet, but the changing political climate in the United States, which has led many Americans to think about the possibilities of, could we have fascism here? And how does that change our understanding of the way in which we understand European history and our relationship to it, has been really important, I think, in reframing some of the ways in which we talk about and teach this history. All of which is to say that at the same time, we're always asked, is it 1938 again? And of course, then we're always really careful. We say, no, you can, as Javi pointed out before, right? Comparison does not mean equivalence, but it's an important analytical tool that we can use. But sometimes it's reduced to that. But I think this has led to some interesting questions that have informed our teaching about, and I think you alluded, Natalia, to sort of the contemporary moment, and do we see ourselves as activists? Well, I think we know that we're all functioning in a specific political climate, and we're aware of the importance of what we're doing within that broader climate. So I think we'll get to this later. I'll leave it there, and then we'll continue that discussion.
We absolutely will. And before I ask the same question of Piotr, I'll just add, as someone who is teaching in the US, but also taught in Poland, that my primary sense of comparison between teaching in Europe and teaching in the US is how distant the events of the Holocaust seem to my students, and I think increasingly so from one year to the next. This is geographically distant. This is chronologically distant, and doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of responses I remember from my early years of teaching in the US 20 plus years ago, when it would often lead to some people telling me or sharing with other students where their families were from and how their families experienced the Holocaust. And this is primarily Jewish students. And this hardly happens now. So my sense is that this is possibly also because students don't feel comfortable sharing their personal stories the way they would have a few years ago. But my sense is that this global and in particular American context is also something that connects them to the topic rather than specific story of Jewish community in Krakow or Jewish community in Budapest, because and I actually did this exercise a year ago when I asked students at the beginning of the course what questions they're bringing to this course, what they would like to know at the end of the semester, and I was absolutely amazed that the vast majority of them asked questions about America. What was the response of the US? What did Americans do? What did Americans not do? Why? They were not asking really about Europe, and I slightly panicked, thinking, well, this is a global story, but this is primarily European story. So I think that there is also a rather unique angle to this, and it might be increasingly becoming so, but it's just posing it as a possibility. Piotr, the floor is yours.
Thanks. And probably it's very easy to assume that I'm totally against the category of bystanders. I even don't like this term. Of course, Raoul Hilberg's triangle as a point of reference is still important to discuss his categories and his perspective. But in Polish context, I think that the category of bystander doesn't work at all. So, and I try to somehow explain to my students, because we talked about, of course, about attitudes of Polish society toward Jews during the Holocaust. That's why also we talked about Raoul Hilberg's and about his categories. And it's very challenging. It's very hard to show to students and to describe and to explain why this category it's not accurate. Mostly because of the fact that, for example, during the recent years, after the education about the righteous, most of my students, in their opinion, they are almost sure that it was like a massive Polish movement of the people who support Jews and who try to help them in many different ways. So last time during such kind of discussion, I decided to make a kind of experiment, and I just said, okay, so let's make a huge change. Let's talk about the contemporary situation on Poland, on the border between Poland and Belarus, and let's talk about what's going on there. And I just ask, do you see huge, massive movement of the people who are going to support them. So we just started the discussion about absolutely contemporary and the situation and the current problem. And on this basis, and in the context of this situation, I tried to tell them what was the position of Jews in the interwar Poland, and referring, for example, what can you find, what information about immigrants, about the people on the border, from Polish media, about the process of dehumanization, and so on and so on. So using some parallels, of course, with full awareness of all differences of the situation, I try to show them, do you still see on this portrait all of the Poles who are, going to support and to help Jews? So I think that sometimes the contemporary issues, some contemporary current events are very useful also to talk about the past.
This is fascinating, because what I was going to ask next, and I will ask, but you kind of reverse the dynamic, right? It's using the contemporary issues to better understand and explain the complexity of the Holocaust. And I was going to ask about how contemporary events affect us understanding, and vice versa. So let me go to the question that kind of got us started with putting together this conversation. And I wanted to ask about changes, possibly no changes, but how the full invasion of Ukraine, we were coming close to the second anniversary of the invasion, of the full invasion against Ukraine, and the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, and the war in Gaza, ongoing war in Gaza, how this may or may not affect your syllabus, your thinking about the teaching. Javi, you're not teaching right now, but I'm sure you're in conversations with students. Your own thinking about the documents that you would be teaching, and possibly student responses to Holocaust material. Should we rethink our syllabuses that we put together 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and in what ways? Javi, do you want to go first again?
Maybe now we'll take another round.
Let's start with Avi, and then we'll move to you.
Sure. Just for the sake of variety. So it's a really good question, and I mean, I think obviously something that's been on all of our minds over the last couple of years, and in particular since October, as regards the attack on Israel. So I'll just focus on one specific example, which this semester I'm teaching a seminar on survivor testimony. And testimony collection projects, first during the war and then the immediate aftermath of the war. And then we'll continue to look at audiovisual recording of testimonies up to the present day, and then how they're used in historical writing and research and teaching. And I'll say that, so first of all, as regards the war in Ukraine, last semester at the University of Connecticut, we gave the Dodd Center Prize to the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial, and there was a really fascinating workshop and symposium that took place at UConn at the end of October. And I recall listening to some of the scholars and researchers and activists in the field who have been collecting testimonies from victims of Russian atrocities for legal purposes. And it again, right, like, we're scholars and we're thinking about it, but the process of actually collecting, exactly, so collecting testimonies for prosecution in court cases, it, again, right, we know we use these sources, we use them in our teaching, but it reminded me in a very important way, right, of the specific context which material is collected, and then how it's used for documentation, and that witness testimony as it's collected in a court case for criminal prosecution purposes is going to be very different from subsequent testimony collection projects that we use for historical purposes, right? So we know this intellectually, but it was, again, quite jarring to sort of see that before us and as a reminder, right, of those distinctions. And I'll just say, as regards October 7th, I already had this discussion last week with my students as we were starting to, actually we started with reading poetry of Bialik, Chaim Nachman Bialik, and looking at the aftermath of the Kishinev pogrom. And I was supposed to teach that poem in my modern Jewish history class in the fall, and it was in the middle of October, and I just couldn't read it with the class. It was too disturbing to read it the week after the invasion. And it was quite striking then. It reinforces how shocking it is and how shocking it must have been that Bialik, after being in Kishinev for 5 weeks and recording testimony after testimony with survivors of the pogrom there, then writes this poem that is very ideological, right? So, to think about these sources in a different light. And I'll just say as a last thing, one of the things that I'm really fascinated by, again, it's really important for documentation purposes to collect the testimonies of victims of October 7th. It's important for commemoration purposes. It's important for historical purposes. But I'll say, as a scholar, I'm also quite fascinated by the ways in which the techniques that we have developed for Holocaust documentation projects are now being applied to collecting testimonies for October 7th documentation projects. And I'm really paying close attention to what the commemorative practices look like and are going to look like. When is October 7th going to be commemorated, right? So, we could think about like the debates about when should Yom HaShoah be. I'm really fascinated by how this is going to work out in years ahead. So these are some of the things that I'm wrestling with, paying attention to, and thinking about with my students as we look at these projects taking place right now.
I will just add something that I'm sure you all know, that in a very, in a way, stunning way, the interviews with survivors of October 7th are now available at Shoah Foundation, right? So they were collectively and I'm not sure, I don't know, Javi, if you know if this is something that is ongoing, but they were recorded, those that I listened to were recorded very, very soon after the events, and they're part of the larger collection of accounts of survivors. So this was quite an interesting statement. Javi, so I will turn it to you and then Piotr.
Okay, so first of all, generally speaking, I think that those events did not so much affect our syllabus or our reading list, but they do affect very clearly the discussion in the class. And I remember I was teaching a course about the Holocaust during the invasion to Ukraine, and a week prior to the invasion, Putin didn't tell me anything. My students couldn't understand how the map of Europe is changing and nobody does anything. And it was like a week later and suddenly a new situation is. And so I think it mainly raised question regarding, first of all, about that part of the area. And you might remember that there were some claims that during the Second World War, the Ukrainians were wonderful and helped all the Jews. So that raised many discussion. Of course, their reality was much different. A question regarding archives, which were and still are in a very dire situation in the Ukraine, as well as other question regarding comparative genocide studies and international collaboration and things like that. Regarding October 7th, things are, of course, much more complicated. And I think that the main issue is that here in Israel, we still live in October 7th, the vast majority of us. It's not only that the semester just started, and it's not only that I still have students who are enlisted, their kids are enlisted, their husbands are enlisted, and so on. We have people who were kidnapped and are still there, and we go to sleep every night with them, thinking of them when it's raining or when it's hot. So it's very much present in each and every one of us. And I think, and we must say that as time goes on, and you mentioned testimonies, and we know it from Holocaust studies as well, it takes time to people to say the most horrifying things. And we know now for sure that those people who were kidnapped are being violated on daily basis, raped, men and women, on daily basis. And this is something that any Israeli cannot stop thinking about it. So October 7th is still here. And we are still in the middle of this crisis, which is a very general crisis, because it doesn't matter in what you believed in prior to October 7th. It could be in God, it could be in the strength of Israel, it could be that our neighbors really want to live with peace and with us. Something broke in each and every one of us. And we will return to our beliefs, maybe not to the same specific one, but it will take time. We're still now in this rupture. And what makes things even more problematic for many is the feeling that in different academic circles, the rise of anti-Semitism just even justifies the horrible things that were done to our brothers and sisters. So I think that things here are very different. And of course that, as I said, I'm not teaching, but I'm giving lectures and I'm meeting with students. And I think that one of the main things is that I feel that I must give much more trigger alerts, because I don't know if any one of my students is very much connected to one of those things. So any discussion about anti-Semitism, about violence, about pogroms, about Holocaust denial, anything like that is much more complicated now, as well as commemoration. And you mentioned, both of you, Avi and Natalia, that there are so many. There are actually dozens. The last time that I heard, there were like 80 different projects trying to document what happened on October 7th. And I'm sure that there are many more. It could be children drawings. It could be one of the most important things, the media, all the WhatsApp and things like that, and that were on Telegram and so on. And there are endless projects of documenting, which some of them stem clearly from Holocaust, some of them not, and all are very interesting and very important. So I don't have any perspective about what happened in October 7th. I think it's as a colleague of mine, Guy Meron, said not a long time ago. He said, "You want to hear about my perspective? Come in 70 years." We don't have a perspective. We're still within the event, and it's quite tense to teach or to talk about Holocaust when you know that the audience is bearing those images, thoughts, and terrifying things in their minds.
Thank you, Javi. I'll just say something that for me, before Piotr, of course, something that was striking for me. I even had a moment of very dark sense of humor about the success, the ultimate success of Holocaust education, when one of the women who returned from captivity recalled how she decided to write a diary as a way of coping with her situation, and if Anne Frank wrote, she should write as well, and she had this immediate connection with how the experience of a girl in Amsterdam can help her in the tunnels. Let's just turn to Piotr before we'll maybe start taking questions from our audience. I would like for you guys to maybe follow up yourself before we turn to the audience. But Piotr, now you.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to say something about my syllabus, or about, the conditions of my students after the beginning of war in Ukraine. I have to say that many of my students are refugees from Ukraine. So among my students, because the war is right the corner. So also for Polish students, the events in Ukraine are much closer than the situation in Israel after 7th of October. And I realized, for example, when I was talking about some trophy pictures taken from the Holocaust, about some, and I used some visual materials from pogroms or from some ghettos, I felt this atmosphere in the air that I'm talking about the Holocaust, about some events from the past. But for my students from Ukraine and maybe also part from students from Poland, their associations and their thoughts were in a different place, because some images from the current war were very somehow similar with those which I was, for example, screening for them. And also, this is my question for myself, or should I also incorporate different pictures, different visual materials? For example, if we are talking about the history and about the continuity of trophy pictures, maybe I supposed to use the newest one. This is the first thing. The second, I feel that somehow I'm obliged to add something to my syllabus, mostly in the context of terms, because it's, for me, it's very important, and I feel a kind of the extreme need to talk once again about some terms like genocide, like pogroms, like Holocaust, like anti-Semitism, and even a term Jews. What we are talking about, if you are talking that Jews killed people in Gaza, who you are in mind. And I need this field because all of these terms currently are somehow abused, are very instrumentally used, are politically used, and are overused also. So I feel this need to talk about the terms like pogroms, Jews, anti-Semitism, Holocaust, and all the mentioned before. And the third thing, which is also important for me in the context of syllabus or in the context of teaching and talking about the Holocaust, is to talk about the comparative perspective. Not to talk about the comparative perspective because I would like to show all genocides are equal or based on the same features. But if the Holocaust, for many of my students, for many people, are just like actors of public discourse, the Holocaust became a kind of a touchstone, a point of reference. So, okay, I'm not against comparison. So let's compare. But also because of the fact that I would like to show in this way the uniqueness of the Holocaust or the differences between the different types of genocide or just war crimes or crimes against humanity, so on and so on. That's why I feel this need to talk about terms and to the feel of comparison, because I think that a lot of terms are overused now.
Again, I'm looking at the clock, and it's one of those moments when I wish we could stretch time. But let's go for one more short round. If you guys had any thoughts that came out of the cross-talking, and then we'll take a couple of questions that were raised in a comment section. Avi, do you want to maybe come back?
Sure. And yeah, and I'll keep it brief because I know you want to take questions from the audience, but I'll just say that, one of the things that I find quite striking and that Javi mentioned in particular is sort of in Israel, the sense of still being an October 7th, right? That and the real disconnect, and it's again, it brings to mind, right, this idea of sort of being right in the middle, in the thick of a war zone, and then how the outside world perceives it. And there is this really striking disconnect between sort of, this expectation on the one hand of, okay, what's the planning going to be like for the day after? Or what are the political implications of this? Or how does this affect the US presidential race or the politics of it? And there's just such a strong disconnect. And I'm talking particularly from the US perspective, between the perception from here in the outside world of like, well, why can't they move on, right? Why aren't they looking to the next day versus, as Javi alluded to or said, being still in the middle of it, right? And this, the expectation, and I appreciate that you pointed out sort of the distinction between testimonies that are collected the day of or in the immediate aftermath, testimonies that will be collected a year or 10 years after, or as Guy suggested, the 70 years later, right? Which is, now we're that's what we're working with in terms of collect projects that collected testimonies in the last 10 years from survivors of the Holocaust. So I find that really, really quite striking. And then the last thing I'll mention is, in terms of functioning in different political contexts, and maybe we can discuss this, I'm really attuned and sensitive to the intensity of the political moment that we're in and the tendency to project certain political expectations on what we do in the academy. And, we deal in complexity, right? We deal in pointing out the difficulties. We want our students to think and to analyze. We don't want them to just take a class to check off a box or because it's some performance. And I really think this is very much what we're up against, right? And we have to defend the ability of the academy and universities to engage our students in deep, serious thought of complex problems. And, the rest of the world wants us to have quick answers and check off boxes and find easy solutions. And I think we have to, create a space in our classrooms where we can sit with that complexity and analyze it and hopefully analyze it without the external influences.
I would add to this, I agree with every word, but I would add to this that also in terms of public history, right? It's not just in a college or graduate courses, but this expectation of palpably digestible, easy answers is beyond, and it's a difficult temptation that needs to be fought against. Piotr, do you? It's actually interesting because again, we were going to talk about being an activist versus scholar, but what comes out of this conversation is how much scholarship is, in a way, activism. Piotr.
Yeah, just like just few words. So the first thing is that, of course, I think that in this very moment also the Holocaust scholars should be present in the public debates, not only about or over the wars in Ukraine and Israel, but also about some, for example, new series of Netflix, because we are still dealing with the problem of Holocaust denial and negationism and so on. And even there is a start of the conversation about the newest movie, The Zone of Interest. So in this way, I think this public activity of being a kind of clerks, let me say, and people, the scholars who are publicly engaged, I think it's extremely important. But on the other hand, in the context of war, I don't know if you agree with me, but I feel a kind of pressure that this is the pressure targeted mostly at Holocaust scholars, that they should speak up publicly to say something and mostly to condemn the events in Gaza. And this expectation is mostly formulated from the people who would like to describe the events in Gaza and the war in Gaza as another kind of genocide. That's why the Holocaust scholars, because they are dealing with genocide as a Holocaust was, they're supposed to say something and condemn. I feel this pressure from many different channels, and I'm wondering if it's a kind of let me say my Polish experience, or it's like also yours experience.
Avi, I think I know, and Avi and Javi, I think I know what you're going to say in a quick way. But do you want to continue this conversation and respond to Piotr? And then we will definitely go to at least a couple of questions.
Well, first I'll say that one of the things that is most interesting, this whole discussion is opening for me different directions that I should think over and discuss with my friends. But one of them is really the question of terms and what, which Piotr mentioned, and of course the question of what is Jew, what does it mean to be a Jew, and where do we place the history of the Holocaust within this much more general context. But to the very difficult question that Piotr had just offered, I raised. This is my problem. I think that many times we see an act to use the Holocaust as an act of activism, which is just people looking for justification for their positions, which they hold much before. And I would want people to use the Holocaust as challenging their views and not as confirming their previous thoughts. And this is why I think that we should talk with much more question marks than precise things to say. I think that, and we can detail it later on. Unfortunately, I think that some of my colleagues are using their academic status to say political views, which they can have as private people, but misusing the academia is, from my point of view, a very problematic thing. And we can discuss it much longer. I don't want to take too much time for now.
Avi, do you want to add? And then
I
guess
don't have.
Helis is on the screen, which is a signal for us to.
Absolutely, I'll be super. I don't have much to add to what Javi said, except to say that I completely agree, and I think it reinforces just how careful we have to be, both in our positions as academics, both in the types of expectations that are projected onto us and to how we use history, right, for political purposes. We just have to be very aware and very careful about that, and be very specific. We are, to some extent, the guardians of these types of terms that are used, right? So in as much as we have a responsibility to, point out when we think like terms like genocide are being misused in certain contexts, or pogrom for that matter, right? It's our responsibility to be the ones to say, well, actually, right, the proper use of the term would apply here, but not here. And sometimes it's not the most popular thing, but I think we also have an obligation to be very precise in the type of language that we use.
I'll just say, I kept on thinking, again, this is slightly Eurocentric, but I kept on thinking how wonderful and how much easier is the situation of historians of the French Revolution. But on that note, Helis, do you want to pick a couple of questions from our wonderful audience?
Well, first I want to convey from the responses and notes in the chat from our audience, they are all, as I am and our team, incredibly grateful to all of you for this very real, thoughtful, provocative conversation. And I do hope this is the beginning of several, because I see from the comments, and I think generally one of the issues that are coming out is, I'm an educator in X place, those people in schools, those people at day camps, those people who are Hillel professionals on campuses. How do we reach out to you as members of this campus community? Because we are feeling, that we're pushed to the wall. We don't have answers. How do we help our students understand for themselves? And you all said this, who are we and how do we understand these terms that are being used and abused? So I think that's the question, is how might you speak to that? Maybe it's not now, but maybe in a future, conversation with all of you. But I want to share that from what we're reading from those of us who are able to join us tonight. Natalia?
So I just want to say that among many wonderful comments and interesting comments, one comes from a historian of the French Revolution who says that it's not so simple either. So apparently
Right.
I lack complexity in understanding that they are also challenged by contemporary discussions and discourses in their academic expertise. So my greetings to the scholars of the French Revolution and words of solidarity. I want to maybe just raise one question, because we are now going slightly over time. One question that asks about Holocaust education as a tool in fighting anti-Semitism, something that many people who created institutions and programs were hoping that Holocaust education would do, and we're being asked what do we make of the fact that with all these programs, among others, the USHMM, in all these tools that Avi mentioned, that anti-Semitism is on the rise. What does it mean for education and the connection between education and anti-Semitism? Do you want to maybe very quickly tackle it? We don't need to go through the whole thing, but if someone wants to take it, that would be wonderful.
I can start, and then if people want to jump in. Yeah, I think this is a excellent question. As I alluded to in the beginning, that there's really been a move in the United States, and actually globally, right? This idea to advance and move forward Holocaust education efforts with a belief that if only we taught our students about the history of the Holocaust, that would, in some contexts, not everywhere, that would lead to a reduction in anti-Semitism. And obviously, that has not been the outcome. I'm not saying that in a glib way to say that it was necessarily a mistake to advocate this. It's just that we have to be really careful about, first of all, what our motivations are for teaching about the Holocaust. There's an argument to be made that it's just important to teach about the Holocaust to understand that it happened and to sit with that very uncomfortable reality that this happened and know what humans are capable of, and that's it. And if students learn about it for that purpose and take something about understanding the human behavior in that way, that's important enough by itself. But I think also, as we've talked about the politics of Holocaust education, we have to be really aware of what the expectations have been projected onto this education, especially in places where insufficient resources are provided to teachers. And I don't want to blame teachers who have to teach a long list of things for concerns about the outcomes. But we also know that sometimes if it's not done well, that can also lead to undesired outcomes. So I just think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about what our goals are for advocating, how to provide resources for teachers for how to do it well, and maybe remove some of those expectations of what we hope it will accomplish.
Maybe I'll just add that unfortunately I agree with each and every word Avi said. Just a friend said it's like trying to convince a youngster not to smoke. So some wouldn't have smoked anyway. Some haven't heard about smoking, but now it seems cool, so maybe they should check it up. And the others, in any way, they were against it. So there is a very good question. And teaching the Holocaust in order to fight anti-Semitism, I think that's something that we all should rethink, as Avi said. I would also add that maybe we should think, how do we connect the question of anti-Semitism, which of course is far beyond the Holocaust and has much more facet. And here we can talk about not only anti-Semitism, but unmodern Jewish hatred and many other things, and their connection to other forms of racism and other groups. And I think that the main thing is to find a way to discuss anti-Semitism in a way that makes it clear that anti-Semitism is not only a problem of Jews. And anti-Semitism, the existence of anti-Semitism, is a very bad sign to us as human beings, as societies, regardless of being Jewish or not Jewish. So that's just one small thought.
Piotr, do you want to add?
Just a small comment. There is also the other side, because when I'm talking now, I'm thinking about the previous visit of Elon Musk in Auschwitz. So this is also the story how, for example, Holocaust memory sites are used to diminish, to whitewash anti-Semitism. So it's absolutely a different option, and this is the different perspective. But I think that this is also very challenging, because there is a lot of public persons who are spreading a lot of anti-Semitism, but they used also the history of the Holocaust or Holocaust sites to just to cover, to whitewash their way of public presence of anti-Semitic threat. Yeah.
And I will follow up with one example that for me is a challenge in this matrix, and it connects to something that Avi was saying earlier, how people encounter Jews and Jewish history only through the lens of the Holocaust, and what it means when I show in a big classroom where I'm teaching this semester with huge screen to the left and to the right, Nazi caricatures of Jews, and we discuss, how they were seen as connected to money and connected to pornography and connected to power, of control over the media. And I know that all this stuff is very much present in social media, that they are watching the moment that the class is over, or possibly as the class is still going on. So this is a very challenging tool that is, I think, both a source of intellectually great opportunities, something that Javi especially was talking about, right? How you can open, all of you, how you can open and complicate matters, but it is walking on very thin ice often. Thank you, Halis, for giving us a chance, a platform for this conversation, and thank you for everyone that was with us.
So I would just like to echo Natalia's words, if I may. First of all, thank you all. First of all, thank you, Natalia, for bringing us together, for saying these are the people we want to talk to about and engage in this conversation. Avinoam, Piotr, and Javi, and Natalia as well. I believe, and there's a lot of demand in the comments, when is part 2? And I hope that we will be able to reconvene. You've really touched on so many issues that resonate. People are curious, they're concerned about, and I hope that we have the opportunity to explore a little bit further as your thoughts and your reactions begin to formulate, knowing how flexible and how reactive they have to be. When do we become prescriptive? And that's a huge question. So on behalf of the Toby Center for Jewish Life and Learning, I thank all of you for your time and your wisdom and experience. To you, audience, thank you for joining us. And please do join us again in February. If you are interested in supporting these kinds of programs, please let us know by pushing the donate button. We sit between the Hebrew date of Tu B'Shvat, when the trees begin to show signs of life, and between International Holocaust Day, and I think that it's very apt that we're meeting with one hand, we are reaching down, and there's bareness and concern in a survival mode method, but also that there are signs of hope as we all work together. So thank you. Laila Tov, Dobranoc.
Thank you.
Thank you.